my name is Arthur Sayer, and this is our PowerPoint presentation on early 20th century Europe to contemporary Europe. Some background knowledge is through the rise of nationalism and international tensions that came in the period previous to this. So with the unification of German states under Prussian ruler Otto von Bismarck, it led to the rise of a unified Germany that filled the power gap left by the weakening Ottoman Empire, which was falling due to the lack of stable flow of resources and political instability within because of different Muslim sect tensions. There was also tensions in Austria-Hungary between the native peoples and the Austrian rulers who were subjugating them. Next, we had the global shift in balance of power. Like I mentioned previously, after the Ottoman Empire's drop in military power, there was an imbalance favoring the Western powers, which allowed them to accelerate their economic and military expansion. This is referencing Germany's unification and Russian support of the Balkan states. Next, the impact of technological advancements at the time. So some technological advancements were planes, which allowed for aerial photography, as well as hot air balloons, which, shown in the picture there, allowed Nadar and photographers like him to take pictures from above so that strategists could get a better view of the ongoing battles, which allowed for more accurate maps. There was also other advancements such as extracting ammonia from the air. This was due to the experimentation by a German scientist called Fritz Haber, which allowed for the cheap production of fertilizer as well as the cheap production of gunpowder, as the ammonium nitrate that he produced was used to supply the German war machine during the First World War. So, next slide is World War I. Next, the spark that started World War I on June 28th of 1914, Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated in Bosnia while he was visiting to calm the population to recent insurgencies. This was about a month after he came to power and took over the Bosnian territory. So there was a lot of tension building in that region at the time. When Archduke Ferdinand was assassinated, Austria-Hungary believed that Serbia was involved in the planning of the assassination because the assassin was a Serbian nationalist. But in reality, the Serbians were not involved in the assassination. But this belief that they were involved caused Austria to declare war. Next slide. The web of alliances. So when Austria declared war on Serbia, Russia was allied with Serbia at the time, so they joined into the battle. And Russia was allied with France, so they also declared war on Austria. Austria called Germany into the war, which brought them on the side of the Triple Alliance. So the reasons why the French joined the war was because they wanted their old territory that was taken during the Franco-Prussian War, which would be the territory of Alsace-Lorraine. Russia joined the war because they had guaranteed independence to Serbia, and Germany saw it as an opportunity to expand their territory. Next, advancements in military technology. Like I mentioned previously, the use of ammonium nitrate for explosives and gunpowder. Then they used chlorine gas as a chemical weapon, which was first used by the Germans. They also invented tanks, which, as the picture shows, the Mark I, which was used by the British, to aid infantry in offensives to allow them to pass through no man's land without being attacked. They also invented rear-aiming turrets on planes to protect them from attacks from behind. They also invented infantry helmets compared to the previous officer caps that they would mostly wear. They also used railway guns, which were artillery turrets mounted on railway tracks. Next slide. And this is the Russian Revolution. So the causes for the Russian Revolution. So it all started before World War I, which was due because the lack of food for citizens and the extreme oppression under the Tsars created much tension. And when the new Tsar Nicholas II, came into power, at his inauguration, immediately after his inauguration, he decided to go party in France, which made people despise the Tsar regime even more. Then, to try and fix this and incite mass patriotism among the Russian people, the Tsar declared war on the Japanese. But they lost the war, which infuriated the Russian people. Then there was the massacre of peaceful protesters in February, known as Bloody Sunday, as well as bad working conditions, which led to worker strikes, the Rasputin scandal, and widespread starvation during World War I. Next slide. There were many attempts for revolution during this time period, but there was only one that was successful. So we had the worker strikes and uprisings in 1905 revolution. We had the discontent among peasants and urban workers. With the February Revolution in 1917, with the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II, which led to the formation of provisional government and the rise of Soviets. Next slide. Key figures of the revolution. Some of the key figures were Vladimir Lenin, which was the leader of the Bolshevik Party, an architect of the October Revolution, and head of Soviet Russia. Leon Trotsky was a strategist and orator that organized the Red Army and played a vital role for the revolution. Tsar Nicholas II was the last emperor of Russia, abdicated after the February Revolution and executed by the Bolsheviks. Alexandra relied on Rasputin, a mystic healer whose political influence discredited the monarchy and contributed to its downfall. Next slide. So the Russian Civil War. This came after the Russian Revolution, which created a power vacuum, allowing for the provisional government to come to power. But then came the Bolsheviks, who evicted the provisional government from power and created their own government. So
they must be so stressed out with all the ex-humans scrambling.
So when the communists came to power, another party, the White Party, also came into power, the anti-communists. So the Reds, or the Communist Party, were supported by the people because they gave them freedom and it gave them more land, and they promised better things than the anti-communists. But the anti-communists were supported by the Western powers, fearing that a communist Russia would become powerful, or that communism would spread throughout Europe. Next. The effects of the Russian Revolution. So the overthrow of the monarchy established Soviet Russia. It also allowed for the redistribution of land and collectivization. It also caused the withdrawal from World War I with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and it allowed for the emergence of the first centralized communist government. Next, the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles and its peace settlement. The Treaty of Versailles made Germany take accountability for starting and continuing the war. This was the idea of war guilt, which was placed upon Germany. Even though the Germans didn't originally start the war, most of the reasons for the war were placed on the Germans because they did most of the fighting. Germany also had to pay billions in reparations because of damages to allied nations. They also limited Germany's manpower to an army of only 100,000. And about 15% of Germany's land was taken and given to other countries, as well as all of German colonies were given to the Allies. They also humiliated Germany politically and crippled them economically. The Great Depression. Next, the Great Depression global effects. So the global trade dropped more than 50%. It also led to a collapse of the gold standard across the world and a rise to authoritarian regimes to attempt to fix these issues and increased nationalism. Next, a Great Depression in the US. Unemployment reached up to 25%, thousands of banks failed, widespread poverty and homelessness, and it led to the New Deal program, which aimed to recover U.S. economy. So the U.S. is important to mention here because before the Great Depression, they used the Marshall Plan, which supported most of the Allied powers as well as Germany to rebuild so that World War I won't happen again. So they attempted to send loans to Europe so that they could pay for reconstruction and all that stuff. But with the Great Depression, they had to take back their loans, which caused most of the European powers to decline, but especially Germany, which led to massive inflation on their side. Next slide. Which then leads up to the Great Depression in Germany. So, like I said before, due to its heavy reliance on U.S. loans, the economy suffered drastically. This also led to massive economic and political instability, which led to the rise of extremist political parties such as the Nazis. Next. Great Depression in Britain. They faced declining overseas trade. They also implemented government welfare plans such as the PAC, and there's a major amount of unemployment and lack of housing, as well as quick currency devaluation, which is just inflation. The Great Depression in France only affected heavily after the 30s, and it also led to political instability, which led to very slow recovery from the economic hit due to World War I. Next slide. Fascism and totalitarianism.
Fascism and totalitarianism. Next slide. For this form of government or ruling of people, some of the key features were that there was almost complete state control of media, education, and propaganda, the elimination of any political opposition, and cult of personality around like the specific leader ruling the state or country, whatever. Some of the most famous totalitarian leaders were Benito Mussolini, which was in Italy, founded fascism, ruled during the World War One and World War II era. Adolf Hitler, which was the leader of Nazi Germany, ruled during pre-World War II and during World War II. And Joseph Stalin, which was the leader of the Soviet Union during World War II and the Cold War era. Next slide. Europe during the interwar period. Next slide. The living conditions and effects during and after the interwar period were some of the following: massive unemployment that was basically up to 25%. Family lived in what was known as Hoovervilles, which is just these really badly made locations of poorly constructed houses, bathrooms, schools, basically anything that has to do with the basic necessities to live. Long bread lines and soup kitchens for food were made to actually supply the American people with the American people, for example, and European and some Asian states for just enough food to live. And there was vast amount of lines for this that took up to 8 hours a day to finally get your food. There was absolute horrid sanitation, overcrowded housing, and basically no job security except if you were at the peak of the ruling tower, so like government jobs. Dust Bowl worsened rural life, which was just that farm fields, so there was nobody to collect eggs, meat, crops, and people migrated away from those areas to try and find other jobs. Some of the lasting effects due to this interwar period were the New Deal programs made by Franklin D. Roosevelt, greater government support such as Social Security, which was seen in places originally like the United States, Great Britain, and then France, followed by the rest of the states that suffered from this economic loss. And it paved the way for future economic reforms because like the economy went so low for so many countries that they had the ability to restart the way they worked their economy and the way they grew or lost anything economic of value. Next slide. World War II. Next slide. The main causes of World War II were the following: the Treaty of Versailles and its very small measures to deal with Germany, the global economic instability during the Great Depression, which was the catalyst for Germany, it will be later explained. Expansionist policy, but will be later. Policies of appeasement and failure of the League of Nations. Another reason is rise of nationalist and militarist ideologies, especially in places such as Germany and Japan. Italy could also be taken as one of these nationalist and militarist ideologies, but it isn't as strong as, for example, Germany and Japan. Next slide. Some of the key events in the duration of World War II, especially battles or just complete invasions, were, for example, starting with 1939, the invasion of Poland by Nazi Germany, which ignited the official start of World War II. Next is the Blitzkrieg strategy created by Nazi Germany, which was a lightning war tactic used to make all of Western Europe crumble in almost just a year and slightly over. Battle of Britain was, well, like it says, battle in Britain in between Nazi Germany and the UK, which was the last standing Western power in Europe against the entire Nazi force, which resulted in failure for the Germans with the RAF of the British holding off all of the Luftwaffe. Operation Barbarossa, which started in 1949, was Germany's, specifically Hitler's, plan to invade the Soviet Union as they deemed the Soviets unfit to survive with their ideology of making a perfect race. Next one, also taking place in 1941, was the Japanese attack on the U.S., leading to the Americans' involvement in the war 2 days later. D-Day, or Doomsday, however you wish to acknowledge it, was in 1941, which was the Allied invasion, mainly U.S. troops attacking the beach of Normandy to liberate occupied Europe, starting with the liberation of France. Battle of Stalingrad, which went from 1942 to 1943, was basically the turning point in favor of the Allies, because in the Battle of Stalingrad, was the first major loss of the Nazi forces, which is when Operation Barbarossa began to stop having any further advancements, and the Russians started doing a comeback and pushing them back to their original national line. The last key event in World War II, which took place in 1945, was the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which was when the United States dropped 2 nuclear bombs, the first time ever, on the populated cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in Japan, because the president did not think that it was worth sacrificing an estimated $250 million of lives to invade mainland Japan. Instead, wished to kill only 80,000, which is a lot, but it did technically save a lot of lives, which led to Japan's surrender. Next slide. The outcomes of World War II were the following: defeat of the Axis powers and the fall of the fascist regimes. So Germany was completely split into East and West. The UN was finally made, which was to promote peace and to stop any fascists or terrorists or dictatorships from ever popping up again in Europe. The emergence of the United States and the United Soviet Union, also known as USSR, see themselves as global superpowers, leading any arms race or any technological race in the entire planet, because they had the edge in weapons, nukes, space programs, anything. They had the advantage. The creation of the Eastern and Western Bloc, which separated any territories given to Russian nation after World War II, which is in the East, and Western nations after World War II, such as France, Spain, Great Britain, West Germany, and Italy. And another outcome of World War II was the massive spread of communism to Soviet liberated nations. So would be the Eastern Bloc, or nations would be Korea, Vietnam, Bangladesh, China. Next slide. The Holocaust. Next slide. How the Holocaust started. It institutionalized anti-Semitism against the Jews and just any races that the Nazis, specifically Hitler, did not deem fit to survive or to live in this earthly plane. After that, it began with the Nuremberg laws, which basically stripped any Jewish people, gay people, African Americans of their civil rights and banned intermarriage. If you don't know what intermarriage means, it basically means that any citizen or natural born citizen, just anybody who has heritage, German heritage, could not marry or have a child with someone of those listed races, which once again I will relist: Jews, gay people, African American, the list goes on, but those were the main groups. Nazi propaganda depicted Jews as scapegoats for Germany's economic and social issues. They depicted them as evil demons and egotistical, like just millionaires that were there to take their money. Hitler deemed them to show, made the people see them as the main reason why Germany was in such a massive economical crisis and the reason why they lost the war. Next slide. Who did it affect? Again, to elaborate on the list: Jews, Romanian people, disabled, mentally and physically ill people, political prisoners, LGBTQ, and other undesirables such as old people, children. And even then, even after all these listed, the list still goes on, because it was whoever they felt like wasn't like part of their perfect race. For example, the Russians weren't part of their perfect race. Next slide. Nazi implementation of the Holocaust, to starting in Poland and Germany. Kristallnacht, or also called Night of Broken Glass, which took place in 1938, was a night where there was widespread violence against Jewish communities, including destruction of synagogues and businesses. Basically, Hitler told the German people to go out and destroy anything that was owned or symbolized Jews. Sometimes the people took it farther than what he asked for and even beat some of the Jews, in some cases killed them, and there was over 300 injured and 50 dead after that one night. This gave Hitler the lift in his ego that he needed to know that the German people were going to be with him through his entire campaign of world domination. Other examples of Nazi implementation of this were the establishment of ghettos, such as Warsaw Ghetto, to isolate and control the Jewish population. Mobile killing units also were made to carry out mass shootings in Eastern Europe. This was made for any Jews, or again undesirables, that left those camps or the ghettos. They were just immediately killed, no questions asked. The construction of extermination camps, or as we know, work camps, whatever you may want to call them, such as Auschwitz, Birkenau, Treblinka, were used as a final solution deemed necessary by the Nazi Party to eliminate as fast as possible and as many undesirables as before their inevitable fall. The use of gas chambers in grim terms for systematic extermination, which was the first time we saw something of this kind in the world, which basically you could even say industrialized murder, so that instead of with guns or knives or just burning, they could kill 800 people a day. They went from 800 to now 12,000 people a day. That's how extremely sadly efficient it was at killing. Next slide. The impact of this genocide, known as the Holocaust, was the eventual liberation of concentration camps by the Allied forces, revealed the extent of Nazi atrocities. So once all the camps were liberated by either usually American or British troops, they would take pictures, documentations, writings, interviews from those in those extermination camps, which just showed to the entire world how badly really the atrocities were in these camps. Because beforehand, they were mostly kept secret, or in the case of the German people, they just ignored it and took it as day-to-day life. Like it was just something normal for them, so they just ignored it. Another impact was the Nuremberg trials, which basically the Allied forces grabbed the Nazi leaders that were still alive after the war, and they prosecuted for the war crimes and their crimes against humanity they have done. The Holocaust spurred the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which took place in 1948, which just deemed that, on the contrary of what the Nazis believed, that some people were not fit to live. It stated that everybody was fit to live, no matter how incapable or dumb or unintelligent they were. More efforts to remember and educate about the Holocaust through museums, memorials, and anything else have been passed down to generations. Even up to this day, schools have not stopped teaching their kids to remember the Holocaust so that this won't be repeated. Next slide. Cultural, artistic, and intellectual development during the 20th century. Next slide. Some cultural developments during the 20th century were art and music, including jazz, rock and roll, and hip hop, that redefined global music, because before it was just slow dance and opera and orchestra. More modern art movements such as surrealism and pop art were also included in these changes. Social changes such as civil rights movements and feminist movements challenged inequality, which basically, for civil rights movements, people of African American heritage or just darker skin color believed, and rightfully so believed, that they should be equal to anybody that had white skin. And feminist movements were just women wanting equal rights to men, such as equal pay, equal importance, right to vote, things such as that. Another social change would be the youth counterculture shaped fashion values, and it caused much protests, specifically private protests in between families, because after World War II, the people wanted more liberty and freedom to do whatever they want to, because after seeing that from one day to another the world could go to end, your life could end easily, the entire city, country could be diminished to a few rubbles. People began to notice how important every single day was, and the youth, they didn't want to be limited by being a good a good civilized citizen or following every single thing their parents did. So a lot of them rebelled, left their homes, escaped with whoever they want to do whatever they want to do, because they began to cherish so much more than they used to before every single day. Intellectual developments during the 20th century, scientific breakthroughs were Einstein's relativity, quantum physics, DNA discovery, space exploration, and space race, and multiple computer sciences showing up, other than obviously the making of the computer. Psychological philosophical shifts were Freud's psychoanalysis, existentialism, and postmodernism reshaped views on the mind, meaning, and truth, which just means that the way the mind works and emotions are expressed and why we express them and why we have certain personalities was expanded and elaborated on like before. Social and cultural thought was growth of sociology, feminism, critical theory, and human rights after World War II, which is explained the slide before with cultural developments. Political ideologies arise such as communism, capitalism, and the rise of democratic and welfare state models such as US for democratic and the USSR for communism. Next slide. Continuity and changes in global conflict. Next slide. Continuities in global conflict were ground troops and traditional combat remained extremely important. Military strategy and leadership was still crucial. Political and economic causes of war continued. Civilians impacted and included in war. Some new changes in global conflict were tanks, jets, nukes, and drones. Air superiority became completely essential to win wars. Guerrilla tactics were much more common than before. Civilians became bigger targets and casualties during those wars, and wars became way more ideological, such as in the Cold War, countries choosing in between capitalism or democracy, you could say, and communism.
After World War II, Europe was divided into a capitalist West and communist East. The US and USSR emerged as rival superpowers, and Cold War tensions shaped the global politics. The Marshall Plan and NATO aligned the West, while the Warsaw Pact united the East. Decolonization changed the global influence, and economic recovery led to the creation of the EU. Next. Post-war Europe faced economic ruin and destruction. The Marshall Plan provided US aid to rebuild Western Europe. In contrast, the USSR rejected this aid and tightened control over Eastern economies. Economic cooperation in the West led to the ECSC, a first step toward today's European Union. Next. The Cold War was a battle of ideologies, capitalism versus communism. It included proxy wars like Korea and Vietnam, the arms race, and nuclear threats. Events like the Berlin blockade and the Berlin Wall symbolized division. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought the world close to nuclear war, though there was a period of detente tensions flared again in the 1980s. Next. The US and USSR filled the power vacuums after World War II. Each led opposing military blocs, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The space race and technological rivalry like Sputnik and the moon landing showcased their competitions. Espionage and propaganda influenced global perceptions. Next. Decolonization triggered independence movements in Africa and Asia. However, it also sparked ethnic violence like the breakup of Yugoslavia and genocides in Rwanda and Bosnia. European nations also faced immigration challenges and struggles with integration and diverse population. Next. Western Europe embraced democracy, human rights, and economic cooperation. Welfare states expanded education and healthcare. The European Union was officially formed in 1993, deepening integration. However, the region faced economic challenges like the 1970s oil crisis and the 2008 financial crisis. Next. By the 1980s, the USSR faced economic stagnation and public unrest. Gorbachev's reforms, glasnost, and perestroika aimed at change. The 1989 revolutions toppled communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The fall of the Berlin Wall marked the Cold War end, and in 1991, the USSR dissolved. Next. Second wave feminism from the 1960s to the 1980s pushed for workplace equality and reproductive rights. Thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir and Betty Friedan were key. Legal reforms like the Equal Pay Act marked progress, but issues like the wage gap and underrepresentation continued. Next. After World War II, European powers withdrew from their colonies. Nations like India, Algeria, and Ghana gained independence. Many faced economic instabilities and ethnic conflicts. Some retained ties with Europe through trade and diplomacy, but the global order had clearly shifted.
The European Union. The creation of the European Union began after World War II when Europe's states began looking for ways to unite themselves in an effort to prevent future wars and conflict. While the actual European Union itself was not put into place until 1993, there were several organizations and treaties between European member states after World War II to 1993 that began pushing for the ideal that the European Union would provide. This included the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which was created to manage the money brought in from the Marshall Plan. And then later on, you had the European Coal and Steel Community, intertwining key industries between several states. The intertwining of industries meant that these states were much less likely to go to war, as if one state was to go to war with the other, then they would no longer have access to their key industries, making their war machines significantly less powerful and leading them not being able to sustain a full-on global conflict. This is the general trend that led to the creation of the EU, where member nations slowly integrated their economies more and more in order to prevent conflicts from being able to occur. So again, in 1993, the Maastricht Treaty established the EU, deepening already existing political and economic ties among its member nations. As time passed, the EU created institutions to regulate policies and introduced the euro as a common currency to further intertwine member nations' economies. An important note here is that Great Britain eventually leaves the EU more in our time frame, and I think after 2010, because they were not willing to adopt the euro over the pound, and that was a continued source of tension. So recently, they left the European Union. Next, we have migration and immigration, 9.11. So after World War II, Western Europe experienced rapid economic recovery, creating labor shortage, a major labor shortage. After World War II, with the Marshall Plan in place and the absolute devastation of World War II, the European states needed to rebuild, and this caused a massive need for labor, leading to immigration from previously colonized regions, as again, World War II led to a push for decolonization, as these colonies were forced to fight in wars for their states in events, essentially a war against colonization, as Germany wanted to not colonize, but conquer the entirety of Europe, and they were fighting to prevent that from happening. it's kind of hypocritical for them to go back to being conquered peoples. So these migrants did not just impact the economy, they also reshaped European culture and religion. The rise of Islam as a minority religion led to debates over its role in Christian majority societies, especially regarding religious practices like head covering in schools. These debates are still ongoing, even in the modern day. Uh, what is it, 50 years later, 40, 50 years later? Kind of interesting. However, as Europe's economy slowed in the 1970s, anti-immigration sentiment grew. Some blame immigrants for job shortages, and far-right parties like France's National Front and Austria's Freedom Party gained influence by pushing for immigration restrictions. Though they never fully took power, their rhetoric shaped policies across Europe. By the late 20th century, 15 million immigrants had settled in Europe, permanently altering its social and economic landscape. There are still ongoing debates about immigration in countries all over the world. Very heated topic. Technologies. The advancements in medical technologies in the 20th century revolutionized healthcare and reproductive medicine. The birth control pill, funded by feminist Margaret Sanger, gave women a new level of control over their reproductive choices. Abortion procedures became much safer with antiseptic tools and antibiotics. Fertility treatments advanced with in vitro fertilization, which led to the birth of the first test tube baby in 1978. At the same time, genetic engineering allowed scientists to modify DNA, offering potential cures for genetic diseases, but also starting ethical debates. Genetic modification leads to GMO production with food sources, which is an extremely beneficial thing, as it allows for farmers to grow crops that are more resilient and are able to produce higher yields of food in the same acreage, and with uh, helping to maintain population. As if you're able to produce more food with the same acreage, then you can maintain a larger population in the world. We haven't quite gone to the point where that's become strictly necessary, but fastly approaching. These innovations raise significant social and moral concerns, increased lifespans, strained welfare based healthcare systems, leading to debates over rising taxes. This is still a continuing issue, especially here in the United States, where Social Security and other welfare consists a massive amount of the federal budget every single year. The Catholic Church strongly opposed birth control, abortion, and IVF, arguing that human intervention in reproduction defied divine authority. Genetic engineering further fueled fears of eugenics, recalling the dark history of racial purification efforts. Callback to the beginning of this section with World War II and the eugenics in place there. As medical technology advanced, society fought with balancing scientific progress and ethical boundaries. It's an interesting ethical question whether, as a society, we should allow children with known genetic defects to be born, knowing that they will live worse lives. If it's morally correct um, to abort them earlier in the term. But globalization. In the late 20th century, globalization accelerated, deepening economic, political, and cultural connections across Europe and the world. Multinational corporations like Nestle expanded operations across borders, often relying on low wage labor in developing regions. International organizations such as the EU and UN shaped policies that prioritize global cooperation over national interests. Meanwhile, advancements in communication, including television and the internet, facilitated cultural exchange, with American media influencing European society. A massive reason why American media and products were able to have such a tremendous effect across the globe is that most of the world's developed economies, essentially Europe, Asia, and America, were ruined after World War II. They had been bombed out. Not America, though, because the Americans, since they were across an ocean, none of the major cities, none of the major infrastructure was affected. So Americans became a superpower like the Russians. But because we were not behind the Iron Curtain and secluding ourselves from the Europeans like the Russians did, we were able to have massive effects on their culture, which is shown by globalization and, McDonald's and these type of corporations spreading all across the world. So that's why American media is some of the largest, because they were able to get back up and running faster than anyone else. So transportation technologies also played a role, with automobiles reshaping urban planning and making migration easier. This is very interesting to see in Europe, because many of these cities were built well before automobiles were ever taken into consideration. So most older cities, well, most European cities, have very, very narrow streets, making automobiles impractical and walking the go-to method of transportation. However, with countries that to build up their infrastructure after the automobiles came about and all those types of things, then you see more heavy focus on road work and um, car-based infrastructure. However, globalization brought environmental challenges with industrial pollution and ecological disasters sparking concern. In response, green parties emerged across Europe, gaining momentum by opposing nuclear energy, particularly after the Chernobyl disaster. By the end of the 20th century, these parties had established a strong presence, advocating for sustainability and environmental protections in an increasingly interconnected world. Uh, Quite unfortunately, the Green Party's opposition to nuclear energy very much went against the true objective of the Green Party, which was to reduce global emissions, as nuclear energy is one of the safest forms of energy, as all the byproduct and waste is completely contained and put into bunkers deep, deep underground. Most of it is able to be recycled, but the parts that aren't are locked away forever, never to be seen by human or animal kind. Um, However, the nuclear energy is almost completely green. It's just lets off steam, unlike coal and gas power, which would fill the void without nuclear. If you don't have nuclear power plants, the infrastructure and the technology is not there for things like wind, solar, especially in larger nations that don't. Well, green energy from thermal vents or geothermal activity is feasible, and some nations are able to use it. Same thing for green energy from hydro sources, and some nations are able to use it. However, most nations do not have an easy access for that, or are too large to make use of their coastlines and such. So they have to rely on fossil fuel of burning on fossil fuels, and nuclear energy provide an alternative to that that would work, but people campaigned against it, so now we don't have any. Well, our supply of nuclear power plants is reducing as they shut down over the years, and we're not constructing new ones, except in China. 20th and 21st century culture, arts, and demographic trends. In the 20th and 21st century, European culture, arts, and demographic underwent significant transformations. After World War I, scientific optimism gave way to disillusionment, fueling philosophical movements like existentialism and postmodernism, which questioned traditional values and absolute truths. Religion declined in influence, but still played a role in resisting totalitarianism, as seen in the Catholic Church's support for Poland's solidarity movement. The Second Vatican Council modernized Catholic practices, making Mass more accessible. Um, After World War One was the first example of a true industrialized war between industrialized nations, because up to that point it had been industrialized nations fighting against unindustrialized nations, which was a completely one-sided battle where they were just uh, ran through and there was nothing they could do to stop the industrialized nations, right? Like you had when the British and the French and basically all of Europe was carving up Africa, and when England was going into India and China. However, World War II was Europeans fighting Europeans, meaning that it was industrialized powers versus industrialized powers, so you had a level of destruction never before seen. Up until then, scientific progress was always something good and something to be proud of, but now the public had seen just the horrors, the man made horrors that were possible to be created. So artistic movements reflected the era's upheavals. Cubism, Futurism, and Surrealism broke from traditional forms, while Van Haas architecture emphasized function over ornamentation. Literature evolved with experimental techniques like stream of conscious writing and Kafkaesque themes of alienation. So, an example of this is this artwork here. It is by a Polish artist who was a child during World War II. And in all of his artworks, you see surrealism mixed with the horrors of having to live through World War II and the absolute devastation that it wrought about the population. Post-war consumerism surged as economic prosperity brought new comforts, fueling a baby boom supported by government incentives. Civil rights movements gained momentum with LGBTQ plus activists challenging discriminatory laws. The counterculture movement of the 1960s, including the 1968 student protests in France, pushed back against consumerism and inequality, leaving a lasting impact on European society. The counterculture movement, the hippie movement, played a pretty big role in changing public perception of events. Like with Vietnam War, the the general train of thought with the younger generation is that we should not involve ourselves in these bloody conflicts. We should not force our people to go fight for a war they do not believe in. And it was a major cause of tension within the U.S. In the time period. So continuity and change in the 20th and 21st centuries. The devastation of war forced European nations to rely on social welfare and mutual aid, leading to a shift towards a unified European identity. However, ideological divisions deepened as democracy clashed with communism, fueling the Cold War. Nationalism and demographic shifts from immigration further heightened separatism and discrimination, exacerbating global tensions. You continually see between the 20th and 21st century issues on migration, immigration, and the conflict between capitalism and communism. Even though the Cold War ended in I believe it was 1989 when the Berlin Wall fell, um, there was still tension between the communist and the capitalist states even into the 21st century, and there still are now, like with Russia and Ukraine and China and the U.S. Governments sought stability through two competing models. Western Europe embraced capitalism and democracy, while Eastern Europe followed the Soviet Union communist path. An ideological divide led to an indirect global conflicts, diverting attention from ethnic atrocities and accelerating decolonization. As the major nations were no longer able to focus all their resources on maintaining their colonies and were instead fighting in proxy wars or other such things, the colonies and the people within them were able to rise up and take back over their countries. Again, trend continuing throughout the 21st century and into the 21st, throughout the 20th century into the 21st. Technological advances reshaped daily life and strengthened globalization. Economic growth surged and improved transportation and global trade gave Europe access to vital resources. However, globalization also led to rising inequality as minority groups were excluded from economic benefits and environmental degradation, which prompted the rise of the Green parties opposing unchecked industrialization. Um, you see this in places like India and China and Southeast Asia, where they do not have the same human rights laws. So as they industrialize, they produce massive amounts of pollution, and because their governments do not care about the people that much, the corporations are allowed to come in and produce goods extremely cheaply without regard for human life and just dumping waste into the world, hurting the environment and just hurting everything. So social movements, and again, trending from the 20th to the 21st century as money rules over everything. Social movements fought for equality, with issues like birth control remaining controversial. Nationalism fueled ethnic and political conflicts, contributing to the rise of xenophobic rhetoric. Meanwhile, intellectual and philosophical discourse shifted as existentialism and postmodernism rejected traditional value frameworks, reflecting the lingering anxiety left by the world wars. Same story as always, where people reject the old and bring in the new. It's a trend throughout all of history, and it continues now from the 20th to 21st centuries. And here are our sources.